The snow was falling harder than a bad decision on a Friday night as I stood in the cramped war room of Ellerslie Barracks, just outside the little town of Ashford in Kent. It was December 19th, 1944, and the news was grim. The Germans had launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, what the papers would soon call the Bulge. To most, it was a death sentence. To me, it was a challenge, one I was ready to meet head-on. I'm Colonel Jack Morgan, commander of the British 3rd Armored Division, and I was about to pull off what everyone said was impossible. The Germans had smashed through the thin American lines, and their advance was threatening to split the Allied forces in two, putting Antwerp, the vital port, at risk. The generals around me were grim-faced, muttering about the worst winter in 60 years and logistical nightmares. But I had a different plan, and a stubborn streak that wouldn't quit. As I pored over the maps, I couldn't help but smirk. They thought this was the endgame. Well, they hadn't met me yet. I was 42, not old but seasoned enough to know that wars aren't won by sitting on your hands. My uniform was a bit less pristine than the brass liked. My boots caked with Kent mud, my greatcoat pulled tight against the biting cold, and a faded scarf wrapped loosely around my neck. The cigarette dangling from the corner of my mouth was more habit than pleasure, but it helped keep the nerves at bay. My staff called me Morgan the Bulldog, partly for my tenacity and partly because I once refused to eat anything but steak during a French campaign. I like to think they admired the gumption, but maybe they just liked steak. The plan was audacious. I told the commander-in-chief I could turn my entire division north in 48 hours to counterattack through the freezing forests. Everyone thought I'd lost my marbles, but I wasn't bluffing. The truth was, I'd been preparing for this moment for years. My division was battle-hardened, but what set us apart was how we handled the cold. While many troops were shivering in wool and cotton jackets, I'd insisted on better gear, leather gloves, thick socks, and lined boots. My men joked I was trying to turn them into Eskimos, but when frostbite set in as a real threat, they were grateful. I stepped outside the barracks, the wind cutting through my coat like a knife. The frost glittered on the bare branches of the elms, and the ground crunching underfoot was frozen solid. I paused, looking out over the darkened landscape, knowing that very soon, this quiet English countryside would become a battlefield drenched in blood and snow. Right then, I muttered to myself, let's make some history. Little did I know this winter would test not just my leadership, but the very limits of human endurance, and that the enemy was about to learn a harsh lesson. Underestimating a determined man in a cold coat is a dangerous mistake. The morning after that meeting, I found myself behind the wheel of a battered old Jeep, the engine coughing and sputtering as if it shared my anxiety. The air was so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass, and the breath of my driver, Private Collins, puffed out in quick white bursts. Around me, the men of the 3rd Armored were stirring to life, grumbling over frozen rations, tightening scarves, and checking rifles that had a tendency to freeze up on the coldest mornings. I liked to think of myself as a hands-on leader, none of this sitting behind desks and barking orders. So, there I was, bundled in a thick woolen greatcoat, the collar turned up to hide my jaw clenched against the chill. My leather gloves were worn but sturdy, and my boots, well, they'd seen better days but had already carried me through mud and blood across Europe. I spotted Sergeant Baker, a wiry man with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, adjusting the straps on his helmet. The man looked like he hadn't shaved in weeks, but in the freezing fog, a shave was more dangerous than enemy fire. "Morning, Sergeant," I called out. "Hope you're ready to move." He grinned, teeth chattering. "Sir, I was born ready, though I might be a bit frozen to the spot." I laughed, the sound rough and brief in the frosty air. "Good. We'll need that spirit. The Germans think this weather will slow us down. They don't know how stubborn Brits can be." The truth was, the Germans had launched their offensive with a fury that stunned us all. Their tanks, sleek Panthers and hulking Tigers, ripped through American lines like a hot knife through butter. But what they didn't expect was the speed with which we could adapt, and the grit in these men's eyes. As we prepared to wheel the 3rd Armored north, the weather was our greatest enemy. The roads were slick with ice, hidden potholes threatening to swallow trucks whole. The snow fell steadily, turning the landscape into a monochrome nightmare. Visibility was poor, and every mile was a battle against nature itself. But the men moved with a purpose. Infantry trudged through knee-deep snow, their uniforms heavy with damp, rifles clutched tight. The tank crews, faces smeared with soot and frost, worked feverishly to keep engines running. I saw Private Evans, barely 19, adjusting the tracks on his Sherman tank while his breath froze on his lips. I pulled my scarf tighter and nudged the jeep forward. "Move out," I barked, the sound echoing off the barren trees. The convoy snaked through the countryside like a metallic river, headlights piercing the gray gloom. Trucks groaned under the weight of supplies, ammunition, food, fuel. 62,000 tons of it packed into the belly of this frozen beast we were about to unleash. At night, I made it a point to visit the front lines. My coat was heavy, my face numb from cold, but I knew the power of presence. Seeing your commander sharing the misery of frostbitten toes and frozen fingers was worth more than any speech. The men called me Old Iron Jack behind my back, partly for my steely gaze, partly because I never seemed to feel the cold. One evening, I found myself near a makeshift camp, where a group of tired soldiers huddled around a flickering fire, their breath rising in ghostly wisps. Among them was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, one of the few women serving as a signals officer. She wore a heavy dark green uniform tailored to fit her slender form, her boots scuffed but sturdy, and an old woolen cap pulled low over her auburn hair. "Cold enough for you, sir?" she teased, handing me a mug of lukewarm tea. I grinned despite the chill. "If it gets any colder, I'll start considering hibernation." She smiled, eyes twinkling. "Well, no time for naps. The enemy's waiting." I nodded, feeling the weight of the coming battle settle deeper in my chest. The snow outside was quiet now, but soon, it would echo with the roar of engines and gunfire. As I sipped my tea, I thought about that infamous phrase I'd already told the brass, "Play ball." 2 words that set this entire operation into motion. If this gamble paid off, it would be a masterstroke. If it failed, well, I'd probably be remembered as the bloke who froze to death trying. But deep down, I knew one thing. When the snow turns red, it's not just the cold you have to fear. The real battle was just beginning. The dawn broke like a silver blade slicing through the icy sky as I stood atop a ridge overlooking the frozen valley below. The wind bit at my cheeks, and frost clung stubbornly to my eyelashes, but nothing could dull the fire burning in my chest. Below, the men of the 3rd Armored Division were moving into position, their tanks and trucks forming a long serpentine line that disappeared into the white haze. My greatcoat billowed behind me, and I adjusted the leather gloves that had saved more than one finger from frostbite. My boots crunched on the crusted snow, and I couldn't help but think, if I'd known this war would be fought in a giant freezer, I might have taken up baking instead. But then again, pastries don't punch back. The soldiers were a sight to behold. Infantrymen wrapped in thick woolen scarves, their breath steaming in the cold air as they double-checked their rifles. The tank crews, faces smudged with grease and frost, climbed into their Shermans as if they were mounting trusty steeds. Sergeant Baker caught my eye and gave me a thumbs up, his breath forming a small cloud in front of his weathered face. I climbed into the command tank, settling into the cramped space beside my driver, Corporal Jenkins, whose steady hands kept us moving through fields glazed with ice. The tank's engine rumbled beneath us, a comforting growl amidst the eerie silence of the snow-covered forest. Our target was Bastford, a small town whose strategic crossroads could turn the tide of this offensive. The Germans had surrounded it, and the 101st Airborne was holding on by a thread. I promised we'd break that siege. "Ready to make history, Jenkins?" I asked, trying to mask the tension in my voice. He grinned, a flash of youthful bravado. "Ready as ever, sir." As we rumbled forward, the landscape blurred, a ghostly mix of white and shadow. The frozen trees stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, some bowing under the weight. Occasionally, a stray bullet kicked up a flurry of powdery snow, reminding us that the enemy wasn't far. The first clash came sooner than expected. A German Panther tank emerged from a copse of trees, its turret swiveling with lethal precision. The roar of our guns shattered the morning calm. Our Shermans fired back, the metal giants trading fire like angry gods. Inside the tank, the heat was stifling despite the cold outside. Sweat mixed with grime on my brow, and the acrid smell of burnt powder filled the cramped space. Sergeant Baker's voice crackled through the radio, calm and steady despite the chaos. Enemy tank hit. Drivers wounded but holding. I clenched my jaw. Keep moving, lads. We're not here to make friends. Outside, the frozen ground shook with the thunder of artillery. Infantry advanced behind the tanks, their boots slipping on ice, bayonets glinting. I spotted Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell again, this time coordinating signals from a nearby ridge, her figure silhouetted against the bleak sky. Her uniform, though military, clung to her slender frame in a way that was both practical and, I'll admit, caught my distracted eye for a moment longer than it should have. War had a strange way of mixing danger with moments of unexpected beauty. Hours dragged on like a relentless winter night. The fighting was brutal. Men falling buried beneath snowdrifts, tanks grinding to a halt or exploding in fireballs that painted the white landscape red. The cold was a merciless enemy itself. Weapons jammed, engines stalled, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes as surely as bullets took lives. But the men fought on. Their courage was a blazing ember in the frozen wastes. I made my rounds, climbing out of the tank to rally the infantry, my voice hoarse from shouting over gunfire and wind. Hold the line. Remember, we're the finest soldiers in the world. Some laughed through their exhaustion. One private shouted back, "Best bloody line in Kent, sir." By nightfall, we'd pushed the German flank back nearly 5 miles, but the cost was steep. The frozen earth beneath us was slick with blood and ice, and the air smelled of gunpowder and sweat. As I settled into a makeshift command post, a battered farmhouse with frost lining the windows, I pulled off my gloves, letting my hands thaw by a sputtering stove. The room was cramped and smelled faintly of damp wool and stale tobacco smoke. Maps were strewn across the table, and radios crackled with updates. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Germans would regroup, and the worst was yet to come. Yet, despite it all, I allowed myself a grim smile. History was unfolding, and I was right in the thick of it. The question was whether we'd live to tell the tale. As I looked out the frost-covered window into the darkening night, a distant rumble echoed, far away, but growing louder. Something big was coming, and it wasn't just the weather. The next morning, the fog hung low over the shattered fields around Bastford, swallowing the landscape in a ghostly veil. I pulled my greatcoat tighter, the cold seeping through the thick wool to nip at my skin. My boots crunched over the icy ground as I made my way toward the forward observation post, a ruined barn that had become the nerve center of our little corner of hell. Inside, Captain Emily Hayes awaited, her sharp green eyes scanning the maps spread across the dust-covered table. She was a striking figure, tall, with auburn hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, a few loose strands framing her determined face. Her uniform was crisply tailored, the jacket hugging her slender waist, and though the cold made everyone bulky, there was a grace to her movements that defied the harshness of the winter. "Morning, Captain," I greeted, trying to keep the frost from making my voice sound like gravel. She looked up, offering a brief smile. "Jack, the latest reports are worrying. German reinforcements are moving faster than we anticipated." I nodded grimly. We expected nothing less. We're pushing into their flank, but they're not going down without a fight. She tapped a finger on the map. "Here, near Millbrook. Their armor is consolidating. If we don't break through soon, this whole advance could stall." I rubbed my chin beneath the scarf. "Then we push harder. The men are cold, yes, but they're ready to fight. And I intend to remind them why." Stepping outside, the frigid air hit me like a slap. The snow had turned slushy in places, making footing treacherous. I spotted Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell coordinating signals near a battered radio mast. Her dark green uniform was streaked with grime, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold and exertion. The woolen cap had slipped back slightly, revealing a flash of fiery red hair. "Lieutenant," I called, "keep those lines open. Every second counts. She saluted crisply but with a playful grin. Yes, sir. No static on my watch. A chuckle escaped me despite the tension. If nothing else, Sarah's spirit was contagious. As midday approached, the battle surged anew. Our tanks roared forward, their tracks tearing through frozen earth and snowdrifts. Infantry followed, weapons raised, eyes sharp beneath frost-coated helmets. The enemy responded fiercely. Artillery shells exploded nearby, sending sprays of ice and soil into the air. At one point, I found myself standing shoulder to shoulder with Sergeant Baker, his face grim but resolute. Feels like we're walking into the devil's own freezer, he muttered. I grinned despite the tension. Well, if the devil's involved, we better bring the heat. The fighting was brutal. Men slipped and fell, weapons jammed, and the cold sapped strength faster than enemy fire. Yet, the sheer determination of the troops kept us moving forward. I watched as Private Evans, teeth clenched against the cold, hoisted a heavy machine gun into position, his breath steaming in the frigid air. By late afternoon, we had carved a tenuous path through Millbrook. But victory came at a cost. The ground was littered with the fallen, and the snow, once pristine, was stained dark. Back in the command post, I allowed myself a moment to catch my breath. I pulled off my gloves, fingers stiff and numb, and stared at the map. The German lines were thinning, but the threat was far from over. Captain Hayes leaned in, eyes sharp. Jack, intelligence reports suggest the enemy is preparing a counterstrike. They're desperate. I nodded slowly, the weight of command heavy on my shoulders. Then we can't afford to hesitate. We hit them before they regroup. As night fell, a heavy silence settled over the battlefield. A calm before the storm. The snow continued to fall softly, masking the scars of the day's fight. I stood outside once more, the cold biting deep. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, and I couldn't help but feel that the real battle was yet to come. And as I looked up into the starless sky, a chilling thought took hold. In this frozen nightmare, the enemy's deadliest weapon might not be their tanks or guns, but the merciless winter itself. But I had a plan. The question was, would it be enough? By the fifth morning, the cold had settled into my bones like a stubborn guest who refused to leave. The kind of cold that gnawed beneath layers and made even the simplest orders feel like shouting through a blizzard. But there was no time to complain. Bastford was still under siege, and the men were counting on me to pull us through. I stepped into the makeshift mess hall, a battered wooden structure barely holding back the chill, where the troops gathered for a rare moment of respite. The scent of damp wool and stale coffee hung heavy, mixing with the faint metallic tang of gun oil. Soldiers huddled close to small stoves, trying to thaw frozen fingers and swap stories to keep morale alive. Among them was Corporal Miller, a stocky fellow with a crooked grin and a habit of cracking jokes even when the bullets were flying. He spotted me and called out, "Sir, you look like you've wrestled a polar bear and lost." I smirked, ruffling his tangled hair. "Only if the bear fought dirty." Miller laughed, the sound a welcome break from the grim atmosphere. "Well, if you ever do face one, I'll be right behind you, probably tripping over my own boots." I shook my head but couldn't help smiling. Humor was one of the few weapons we had left against the cold and fear. After a quick bite, mostly hard biscuits and lukewarm tea, I made my way to the radio tent. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was there, tangled in wires and headphones, her face flushed from the effort. "Any word from HQ?" I asked. She tapped a finger on the receiver. "Eisenhower's command wants an update. They're nervous about our pace." "Well, let them be nervous," I muttered. "We move when the time's right, not when the clock says so." Sarah gave me a sideways glance. "You're impossible, sir. Someone's got to be," I replied with a grin. Outside, the weather had taken a turn for the worse. Snow whipped through the camp in fierce gusts, turning roads into slick, treacherous paths. Tank tracks churned the frozen mud into slush, and the men's boots sank ankle-deep with every step. Despite the conditions, the men pressed on. I watched as a group of sappers struggled to clear a fallen tree blocking a vital supply route. Their breath came in ragged puffs, faces red and raw from the cold. But they didn't stop until the path was clear. I thought about the German forces, battered and stretched thin, relying on synthetic fuel that froze in their tanks and soldiers clad in threadbare uniforms. They'd gambled everything on this offensive, but their overreach was our opportunity. That afternoon, I rode along the front in an open jeep, the wind tearing at my coat and turning my cheeks a fierce shade of red. I made a point to stop at every unit, offering a word of encouragement or a firm handshake. "Keep your heads down and your hearts up," I told one group of infantrymen. "We'll see the spring, lads." One young private, barely out of boyhood, looked at me with wide eyes. "Sir, do you really think we can win?" I met his gaze, steady and resolute. "I don't just think it, we're going to make sure of it." That night, as the camp settled under a blanket of snow, I sat by a flickering lantern, writing a letter home. The words were stiff, formal even, but beneath the surface lay the unspoken truths, the fear, the hope, the unyielding determination. "Dear Mary," I began, "the winter here is unlike anything I've known. The cold is a constant enemy, but the men's spirit is fiercer still. We face a battle not just of bullets and tanks, but of endurance. I promise you we will not falter." Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery, a reminder that in this frozen hell, the fight was far from over. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the Ardennes, the enemy was gathering strength for a counterstrike that could change everything. The morning air was thick with a biting frost that seemed to seep into every bone, but the men of the 3rd Armored were stirring with a quiet determination that defied the weather. I pulled on my greatcoat, cinched my scarf tight, and donned my battered leather gloves, the ones scuffed from countless battles and frozen mornings. Today wasn't just any day, it was the day we were going to hit the Germans where it hurt most. I climbed into my command tank, Iron Resolve, a hulking beast scarred from previous fights, its steel battered but unbowed. The crew, a tight-knit bunch led by Sergeant Baker, had become more like family than soldiers. Baker's face, streaked with soot and frost, broke into a grin as I clambered aboard. "Ready to give those krauts a proper British welcome, sir?" he joked, the warmth in his eyes a stark contrast to the frozen landscape around us. "As ready as ever," I replied, settling into the cramped space. "Let's remind them why they should never underestimate stubbornness." The plan was bold. Instead of a slow, grinding advance, we were going to strike fast and hard at the German supply lines near Millbrook, cutting off their lifeline and forcing them into retreat. It was risky. Winter roads were a nightmare, and the enemy was desperate, but fortune favored the bold. As the tank rumbled forward, the world outside was a blur of white and steel. Snowflakes danced in the air, settling on the turret and tracks, while the cold bit relentlessly at exposed skin. The frozen trees zipped past, skeletal and silent witnesses to the coming storm. We hit the first German outpost just as dawn broke. A small encampment nestled in a hollow, its guards caught off guard by our sudden appearance. The roar of our guns shattered the morning calm, and within minutes, the enemy was scattering like frightened rabbits. But the real challenge lay ahead. The roads twisted through dense woods, iced over and treacherous. Several times we slipped dangerously close to the edge, the cold mud threatening to swallow us whole. Yet the crew's steady hands and nerves of steel kept us on track. At one point, the radio crackled with urgent news. A German counterattack was forming near Bastford. I exchanged a look with Baker. "We've got to move faster. The men holding the town need relief." Hours later, as we approached the outskirts of Bastford, the sound of battle was a low rumble, punctuated by bursts of gunfire and distant explosions. The town lay shrouded in smoke and snow, streets littered with debris and the scars of relentless combat. I ordered the tanks into position, their heavy guns roaring to life. Infantry followed close behind, their boots crunching over icy rubble. The fighting was fierce. Enemy snipers picking off men from hidden windows, artillery shells turning streets into craters. Through it all, I moved among the soldiers, my breath steaming in the cold air, offering words of encouragement. "Hold fast. We're here to break the siege." Near a shattered church, I spotted Captain Emily Hayes directing a squad. Her uniform streaked with grime but her posture unyielding. She caught my eye and gave a brief nod, a silent promise that we'd see this through together. The tide began to turn as our tanks smashed enemy positions, opening a narrow corridor into the town. The 101st Airborne's defenders pressed forward, their faces etched with exhaustion but glowing with renewed hope. By nightfall, the siege was broken. Exhausted but victorious, I stood atop a ruined wall overlooking Bastford, the snow swirling around me like a curtain. The battle was far from over, but today we had dealt the enemy a blow they wouldn't soon forget. Yet, beneath the triumph, a shadow lingered. Intelligence hinted at a new German weapon, something lurking in the depths of the forest, a secret that could change everything. As I gazed into the darkness, a chill deeper than the winter wind ran down my spine. The war was just getting started. The dawn crept over the horizon like a reluctant guest, casting pale light on the battered town of Bastford. The air was crisp, each breath a visible puff that vanished into the biting cold. I pulled my worn leather gloves tighter around my hands, fingers still stiff from the night's chill. The victory yesterday had been hard-won, but there was no time to rest. The enemy was regrouping, and I could feel the weight of what lay ahead settling over the troops like a shroud. I made my way through the makeshift command center, a jumble of radios, maps, and half-empty ration tins. Captain Emily Hayes was already there, her green eyes sharp beneath a fur-lined cap, fingers flying over the radio dials as she coordinated with forward units. Her uniform, though smeared with dirt and sweat, hugged her lithe frame with an almost defiant elegance. War had a way of stripping things down to raw survival, but somehow she carried herself like a queen in exile. "Morning, Jack," she said without looking up. "The reports are troubling. The Germans are massing near Hartsfield Wood. Recon squads spotted something moving under the tree line. Armored vehicles, but different from what we've seen." I frowned. "Different how?" Emily shrugged, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Heavier. More advanced. Could be experimental tanks or something new they've been hiding." I rubbed my jaw beneath the scarf. "Just what we need. More surprises." Outside, the wind howled through the shattered streets, rattling the loose shutters like a ghost's fingers. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the icy ground, and caught sight of Sergeant Baker rallying a group of exhausted infantrymen. His gruff voice carried over the din as he passed out extra woolen socks and urged the men to keep moving forward. I approached him, the cold biting through my coat. "How are the men holding up?" Baker grinned, despite the frost painting his beard white. "Like stubborn mules, sir. Freezing, but no one's quitting." "Good. That was the spirit I needed." Later that afternoon, I joined the reconnaissance patrol heading toward Hartsfield Wood. The forest loomed ahead, a dark, tangled mass of frost-covered branches and shadows. The trees seemed to whisper secrets, their skeletal limbs creaking ominously in the wind. We moved cautiously, boots sinking into snow and mud, rifles at the ready. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed, and a figure slumped against a tree. The firefight erupted, bullets whipping through the air like angry hornets. Amid the chaos, I caught a glimpse of the new enemy. Massive, heavy tanks with thick armor plating and unfamiliar markings. They moved deliberately, crushing underbrush and tearing through our lines with terrifying efficiency. Back at camp, the mood was tense. Captain Hayes pored over intercepted communications, trying to piece together the enemy's plans. The more we learned, the clearer it became. The Germans were desperate, throwing everything they had into a final, brutal gambit. That evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars blinked into existence, I stood alone on a ridge overlooking the frozen battlefield. The snow beneath my boots was stained dark, a grim reminder of the cost we'd already paid. I lit a cigarette, the flame flickering in the cold wind, and thought about the path ahead. The enemy had pulled a new card from their sleeve, and it was one we hadn't seen coming. But I wasn't about to let that stop me. With a grim smile, I whispered to the night, "They may have their secrets, But so do I. The war was far from over, and the real test was only just beginning. The morning broke with a bitter wind that sliced through the trenches like a razor, carrying the scent of smoke and frozen earth. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck, the coarse wool scratching my jaw as I prepared to lead the 3rd Armored into what could only be described as the eye of the storm. Our intelligence had confirmed it. The Germans had deployed their new behemoth tanks, massive, heavily armored machines that seemed almost invincible. They lumbered through the Ardennes like mechanical monsters, their thick treads crushing trees and tearing through defenses. Rumors whispered among the troops called them iron beasts, and the fear they inspired was no less than palpable. Yet, fear wasn't something I intended to entertain. I stood before the assembled men, the cold biting at my face, my breath visible in quick, sharp bursts. My uniform was layered and practical. A heavy wool greatcoat, leather gloves stiff with frost, and boots caked with snow and mud. But beneath it all was the fire of determination. "Listen up," I called, voice ringing out over the frosty air. "Those tanks might look like giants, but they're not invincible. We've faced worse odds before, and we'll do it again. We fight not just with steel and gunpowder, but with heart and guts. Remember that. We press forward. No retreat." A murmur of assent rose from the ranks, rough voices tinged with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. As we set out, the landscape around us was a frozen wasteland. Trees stripped bare, earth churned to mud and ice, and the ghostly outlines of destroyed vehicles looming like tombstones. The behemoths rumbled ahead, their engines growling like hungry beasts. The battle erupted with a thunderous roar. Our tanks engaged the iron giants, shells exploding against thick armor that seemed to shrug off every hit. Infantrymen darted between craters, their rifles spitting fire as they sought weak points. I found myself in the thick of it, shouting orders and encouragement, the roar of battle masking the cold that gnawed at my fingers and toes. At one point, a shell exploded nearby, showering me with snow and dirt. I shook it off, adrenaline warming my blood. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was at my side, coordinating artillery strikes with a fierce focus that left no room for doubt. Her uniform, smeared with grime and sweat, clung to her slender frame, and despite the chaos, there was an undeniable grace in her movements. "Jack," she shouted over the din, "we've got a flank open near the ridge. If we can hit them there, we might turn the tide." I nodded, signaling the armored units to redirect. With a roar, we pushed forward, catching the behemoths off guard. Explosions rocked the ridge as artillery shells found their marks, and for a moment, hope flickered. But the enemy was relentless. More tanks appeared, and the ground trembled beneath their advance. The snow turned red, the frozen earth soaked with the blood of brave men and women who refused to yield. As dusk settled, the battlefield was a chaotic tableau of fire and ice. Exhausted but unbroken, we held our ground. I lit a cigarette, the flame a small defiance against the gathering darkness. The price was high, but the message was clear. No matter the odds, the 3rd Armored would fight on. And somewhere in the shadows, I sensed a new threat stirring, one that would challenge everything we'd fought for. The war was far from over, and the battle for the Ardennes was becoming a legend written in snow and fire. The night was colder than I'd ever known, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to leave. I sat alone by a flickering campfire, the orange light casting long shadows across the frozen ground, while the men around me huddled in their tents, fighting sleep and the bitter wind. My greatcoat was pulled tight, but even the thick wool couldn't keep the chill at bay. I stared into the flames, watching them dance and flicker, each spark a tiny rebellion against the darkness. The battle had taken its toll, men were weary, supplies stretched thin, and the enemy's new weapons had forced us onto the back foot more than once. But surrender was not in my vocabulary. A soft crunch of footsteps drew my attention. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell emerged from the darkness, her uniform dusted with snow, cheeks flushed from the cold and exertion. She carried a small satchel and a worn leather-bound notebook. "Thought you might want to see this," she said quietly, settling beside me. I took the notebook, fingers numb as I flipped through pages of intercepted messages and sketches, technical drawings of the enemy's latest weaponry, plans for troop movements, and coded communications hinting at something bigger. Looks like they're planning one final push, I murmured. A last gamble to break through our lines. Sarah nodded, eyes serious. If they succeed, it could change the course of the entire campaign. I exhaled a cloud of smoke, the words tasting bitter in the cold air. Then we have to be ready. Every man, every tank, every bullet counts. She glanced at me, a flicker of something unspoken in her gaze. You really think we can stop them? I smiled grimly, the lines etched by sleepless nights and bitter battles deepening. I don't just think it, I know it, because we're not just fighting machines or frostbite, we're fighting for each other. The night stretched on, silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and distant echoes of artillery. Somewhere beyond the tree line, shadows moved, ghosts of war yet to come. As I closed the notebook, a sudden chill ran down my spine. There was more at stake here than just strategy and firepower. Secrets buried in the snow, waiting to surface. And when they did, they would change everything. The war was reaching its climax, and the choices we made now would echo through history. Tomorrow, the final battle would begin. The first light of dawn seeped through the cracked windows of the battered farmhouse that had become my command post. Outside, the frozen landscape stretched endlessly, an unforgiving expanse of white etched with the scars of battle. The air was thick with anticipation, every breath visible as a pale ghost in the cold morning. I pulled on my coat, the weight of the coming day pressing heavily on my shoulders. The men were ready, or as ready as anyone could be when facing an enemy that had thrown everything into one last desperate gamble. The behemoths had been a nightmare, but intelligence hinted at something even darker lurking beyond the front lines. A secret weapon that could tip the scales. Captain Emily Hayes entered, her expression steely beneath a dusting of frost. All units are in position, Jack. The men await your orders. I nodded, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline. Then let's give them a fight they'll never forget. As I stepped outside, the cold bit deep, but the fire inside burned brighter than ever. Tanks rumbled into formation. Infantrymen tightened their grips on rifles, and the air thrummed with the tension of impending battle. The Germans launched their final assault as the sun climbed higher, a wave of steel and fury crashing against our lines. The ground shook beneath the thunder of guns and engines, the sky filled with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Through the chaos, I moved among the men, their faces etched with fear, determination, and unyielding resolve. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio, guiding artillery strikes with precision that saved countless lives. The battle raged for hours, a brutal dance of survival and sacrifice. Snow turned to mud, wounds were tended with frozen hands, and every inch gained was paid for in blood. Then, just as hope began to waver, a roar split the air. Our reinforcements had arrived, pushing the enemy back. The behemoths faltered, their armor pierced by concentrated fire, their engines stalling in the icy mud. As the enemy retreated, silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors. I stood amidst the wreckage, the snow stained red beneath my boots. The cost had been immense, but the victory was ours. Yet, as I looked toward the horizon, shadows lengthening in the fading light, a chill ran deeper than the winter's cold. Because somewhere beyond the fight, a new mystery stirred, one that promised to test us all in ways we had yet to imagine. And in that silence, I knew the story was far from over.